Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Nick Gardner, one of the members of the WPWVC chapter of ACRL. And we're in the Ad Hoc Professional Development Committee. This is our professional webinar series. I believe this is the 8th one that we have done in our first of the new year. We're so glad to have you. Today we will be having, just as a reminder, in about 2 weeks, all of this presentation will be available as a recording on YouTube. I believe Rocco is going to put a link in the chat to our YouTube channel if you want to see our past videos. And additionally, if you are interested in being a presenter, we have a form that you can fill out as well. We are really delighted to have Lauri Thompson. She holds a master's in teaching and learning with technology, and she is the continuing education coordinator for the Tennessee State Library and Archives. And she is actually from Pittsburgh. And you'll all be happy to know that she is a lifelong Steelers fan. Lauri feels that her goal is to make organizations that she works with stronger, and she feels that Excel is a strong personal mission. And I have a direct quote from her that she says, "Data is king, and massaging that data into information should be as easy as possible." So without further ado, please turn your attention here for Lauri Thompson so we can learn the magic of Excel with her.
Well, good morning or good afternoon for you. I'm an hour behind you, so good afternoon. I do love Excel. I was a Lotus fan, and then I ran into Excel a number of years ago, and oh my goodness, it was a whole game changer for me. And every time I use Excel, I learn something a little bit different about it. So today we're going to address pivot tables. Pivot tables scare a lot of people, and I can understand that because when I first started using Excel, they bothered me a little bit too. But they are easy to do, and they are very powerful. So when do you need a pivot table? I tell people you need a pivot table if you can look at a huge spreadsheet and you think to yourself, you know, the information that I want in there is in there somewhere. And you're tempted to get out a piece of paper and a pencil and start making tick marks on your paper to count the number of things that qualify for your question. So that's the first indication that you probably want a pivot table. What will a pivot table do? Well, it will group information for you. It will summarize information for you, and you can filter information. But the secret to making it really work is actually in the setup of the table. Your table has to meet certain criteria in order for the pivot table to work well. The data must be in a traditional row and column format, and that means that you have to have column headers, and they have to be located at the very top of your pivot table. Now you can have a heading above that, just don't include that in your pivot table because it will throw things off. And the error messages in Excel for a pivot table are useless. They say things like, you can't do that. Well, why? Well, there's no explanation given. You just can't. That's the only error message you get. So there can't be a lot of blank cells in your pivot table. So if your data has a lot of blank cells, you're going to get meaningless. So you can see this is a fairly solid set of data. Now, I have to tell you that I did get this from another library here in Tennessee, that I massaged it a little bit so that it's missing about half of its field. I ask you not to judge the data because it did come from a smaller library, and they may have done some things with things like the call number that are just a little bit different than what you might have done. And remember that I work with public libraries generally and not academic libraries, so almost all of this is fiction. So I talked about your column headings being at the very top of your table. Each one of those column headings must be unique because they are going to become the field names in your pivot table, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. Your data has to be consistent, and that means that if you're going to put call numbers in column D, they must all be in column D. Otherwise, your pivot table won't work. If it's going to be a date field, they all have to be dates. If it's going to be a text field, then that's what Excel is going to be looking for. And if you put a lot of numbers in there, it's not going to work as well. Spelling counts, because just like if you're filtering or sorting and you have something that's misspelled, it's not going to work well. And you need to turn off in your table or your range all filters and things like subtotals. So just make it raw data, and then you're ready to rock and roll. So we're going to start by building a very basic pivot table. And the first thing you have to do is click in the middle of your data. Now my data is pretty well defined because that's the only thing that's on this spreadsheet. It is approximately 16,400 lines long. So there's a lot of data here, and it's going to summarize this for me pretty quickly when I get ready to go. Come up to insert. That's the second step. First step is click in the spreadsheet itself. The second step is to click insert. And then one of the first things that you'll see is pivot table. Okay, and you can click on that, and you're going to get a dialog box. This dialog box has been the same for every version of Excel I've ever opened since, like, I don't know, 2005 or 2006, somewhere along in there. And it wants you to select a table or range. So you can see I've got an outline, and it goes all the way down 16,000 rows. It says 16,422 in the table range. So I'm pretty comfortable that I have everything that I need. You'll see the dancing ants around the edge of the material. And I always like to put my pivot table on a new worksheet. That way, if I want to get rid of it, it's really easy. The other thing you need to know about a pivot table is that it recreates the existing data underneath the pivot table. If you put it on the same sheet or on a sheet that has other data, sometimes unhappy things happen. So I put it on a new worksheet almost all the time. And then click OK. And this is where people throw up their hands and just go, oh dear, I'm never going to be able to do this, because they don't understand what has happened. You get a graphic over here on the left. To build a report, choose the fields from the pivot table. Okay, what then would you do with them then? And then there's this pivot table fields over here on the far right. So all of your column headers have appeared here as fields. Okay, everything that we had from the publication date, the title, the author, they're now here as fields. At the bottom, it says drag fields between areas below. Now, there's only 4 words there: filters, which work exactly as you would expect them to, and rows, which are in your pivot table going to work similar to how a row works in a spreadsheet. It's going to be on the left-hand side, and it's going to display the data horizontally. Your columns, which are going to have a column header at the top, working similar to a spreadsheet. You're going to be comfortable here in a moment, but it's going to be vertical. And then values, and this is where you put your data. This field is generally a numeric field, something you're going to count, something you're going to summarize or average. That's what's going to go in here. So you want some sort of a field that you can either sum or count, generally. And then it has usually a numeric value in the field. Okay. The rows and the columns are going to be where you're going to group information. So all you do, and this is so easy, you come up and find a field that you like. And in this case, I'm going to gather up the collection that the books are in. And all of these are books, by the way. I got rid of everything else. And then I'm going to sum up the cost. Now, they have not put a cost in with every book, so this is going to be a little wonky as far as reality is concerned, but it's going to work just the same. So highlight it, click with your left mouse button, and drag down to rows. And now you can see that we have all of the different categories of books that are in the library. Okay. And then we're going to take the cost, that's going to be our values. We're going to click and drag and put it into the values field. And congratulations, you have your first pivot table built. A round of applause for everybody, please, that followed along with that, because it wasn't hard at all. So once I have this set, if that's what I want, I can go in and customize the table just a little bit. I can come in and use, I've got a zoom toolbar on top of some of my ribbon. That's going to be a little bit of a problem. So let me just readjust my field just a little bit. Okay, that's better. I can come in and click on the pivot table toolbar, and I can do some design and make the table a little bit fancier. Or I can come in, for example, and double click where it says row label. And that will allow me to actually label it the way I want to label it. So I can put the word collection in there. And there you go. Now, one thing that people panic about, they call me later and they say, Lauri, I was working along on my pivot table and everything was going splendidly. And then all of a sudden I didn't have a pivot table there anymore. And that's because, or I didn't have the pivot table fields to work with the pivot table anymore. If you click away from the existing pivot table, all of those pivot table fields on the right are gone. And people get a little bit nervous about that. But all you have to do is go back and click somewhere in the pivot table, and your pivot table fields window will come back. This used to be called a wizard, by the way. And when they took the steps away from it, then it just became a dialog box that you could work with. Okay. So any questions so far? Are we doing okay?
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat right now. Oh, so it looks okay.
Excellent. Very good. So I recommend that when you first start doing your pivot tables that you draw out what you want the result to look like. But if you haven't done that and you still want to play, you are fine to do that. You can just keep clicking and dragging fields until you get them where you want them to be. So if I decide that I want to put the date added, for example, below the collection, it's going to stretch out the pivot table quite a bit, but it's also going to give me some information. So, I mean, you can do that if you want. And if you don't like it, get rid of it. Make it go away. Just click and drag and remove it. Okay. I already confessed to you that the sum of cost wasn't really based on reality because they don't have the cost for every single book put in here. But you can use the down arrow to the right of sum of cost. And that's going to bring up a dialog box or a menu that will allow you to choose. And what I want to choose is the value field settings. So I'm going to click on value field settings. By default, Excel chose the sum of cost because that's what made most sense to Excel, and that works just fine. But you may want a count. So instead of giving you the sum of the expense of the books, it's going to tell you how many books are in each category. And I can just click on that count and click OK. And it will change the count of the cost. Sometimes you look at something in your pivot table, and this was a game changer for me. If I see something in my pivot table and I go, there's only one of those, or should there really be 3 of them or something? For example, this large type biography, I can double click on that 5 and it will show me the data that's behind that. Now it created a whole new spreadsheet at the bottom. Okay. So spreadsheet 2 is that sheet that showed me the specific information from that one particular entry in the pivot table. Sheet 1 is the pivot table itself, and the list is actually where the data is. So of course you can rename those if you'd like. But that ability to look and drill down through the data itself and let me confirm or change something that's not quite right. If I see a spelling error, for instance, if they had put no fiction instead of nonfiction in something by accident, and these things do happen, I can go back and fix that in the data. I can come back into the data, and then I need to right-click in the table itself somewhere and click refresh. Okay, once it refreshes, remember I told you that there was a set of data that was sitting underneath the pivot table? When I changed it in the original data, it didn't change anything, but if I change something in the data and I want that data that's sitting underneath the pivot table to be refreshed, then I have to come back and do that manually. Okay. There is no way around that that I'm aware of. Okay. So I'm going to take the publication date and put it in the columns. That seems like a weird place for the publication date, and it really is. But it's good for my purposes. Because when I have it in the columns, I can see exactly how many books we purchased right from the very beginning, or I'm sorry, the publication date for the books that we have right from the very beginning up until I think I gathered this in early 2020 for a presentation prior to COVID. Okay. But it's not really a very helpful piece of information as far as the dates are concerned. Now, if I had done this by purchase date, and unfortunately this library did not validate the field in any way, so they have some really screwy dates in their 16,422 rows, and I tried to go back and clean it up, but that was just a lost cause. Because even a period where the slash mark goes between the day and the month, or spaces at the end of the field will mess it up. But you can actually trim this data down if it's a date, so you can group it together. So I can come up and click on one of the dates and right click, and then it did not right click for me. That's weird. Let's try it again. Okay, that'll work. What is it going to do? Okay, there we go. Group. Once you have right-clicked on the date, group it, and then say starting at 1851 and ending at 2020, which is what my dates are. I could take just a portion of that if I wanted. Group it in 2-year increments, in 5-year increments, in 10-year increments. And for me, 2 is most interesting. So I can go 2, and we can see that as we get closer to current day, our numbers get bigger, of course. But we can actually see, now I could go back and redo that in 10-year increments so that it groups by 10-year increments. This is most useful if you're trying to do something by months and years. Goodness, where did it go? All the way back over here. But like I say, my dates in that, the date added was a rather useless field. Now I can also take that publication date and move it over into a filter field. So I took it out of columns and I put it in filters. All you have to do, click and drag, and it goes, okay? So I can now go up, and there's an additional entry in the top left corner of my pivot table, and it says publication date, and there's a drop down. There's that very familiar filter drop down. And because I still have it in the grouped, okay, I can look at it in just the group. Okay. So any questions about grouping or filters?
If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat so we can let Lauri know.
Okay, thank you.
At this time, I don't have any questions yet.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to take that publication date out, put it back in so that I can ungroup so that everything is back the way it was. How many of you are using tablets at the moment and might be going around and looking at the data on a tablet? And I don't know what kind of data you might be looking at, so I'm asking, because there is a handy little doodad in pivot tables called slicers. And what slicers do for you, again, you have to be clicked into the pivot table. And then you want to go back up to your pivot table tools. And then you want to go to filter. I don't see where, that's good. I just love it when you do something and you lose what you were just looking at. Well, insert slicer, okay. So a slicer is more of a visual filter, and what it allows you to do is actually look at something. So I can click, we'll stick with publication date. So I can click there and it will give me all the years. Okay. And if I just want 1 or 2 or 3, I can change all of the data in the table just by clicking on 1. Now I ask you about tablets because if you are trying to filter something with that filter field that was at the top of the table, it's really tough. I've got a big pad on my finger and sometimes that doesn't work as well. So I tend to try to use the slicers if I'm going to do that. Now, if I'm going to do that, I can actually click more than 1 year by clicking the year and then holding the shift key and clicking multiple years. Okay. So maybe in a particular area, we're trying to get rid of everything prior to the year 2000. So you come up and click everything prior to that, see how many you have, and weed them out. Okay. And this slicers area, really easy for other users to use as well. Okay, so you can also have multiple slicers, by the way. Just go back and do the same thing over again. And put your slicer on the page. Okay. It's like using multiple filters. When I work with adults, I tend always to teach them the long way around first. And there is a much easier way to build a pivot table if it works for you. So you can go back to your data. I went back to the page that says list. I went to insert, and right next to pivot table is a button that says recommended pivot tables. This came out in the 2013 version. So if you're working 2013 and after, and by now I think almost everybody is, because I don't think they're supporting that anymore, you can click on recommended pivot tables and up will come. I don't know how small your screen is, so I'm going to kind of move this over to the right for a moment and put it back. A set of tables that Excel is guessing might be exactly what you want. And indeed, the very first one is what we built. But you can use the sum of the publication date. Okay. And you'll see what it looks like over here on the right. And you can, of course, make the window bigger so that we can see this one. We have sum of circulation and shelved count by category, of course. Okay. And if that's what you wanted, all you have to do is click OK. It creates a new sheet in your workbook, and you're ready to go. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and you'll see that it created a lovely pivot table for us. And as long as we're clicked inside of it, we can do anything we want with it. So we can change it and make it look pretty and do all sorts of things to it. Okay. Now, the other thing that you can do with a pivot table is click on the pivot table tools and you will see a pivot chart. And you can create a chart out of this data without doing anything fancy. If I like the first one, that's fine. If I like a pie chart, that's fine too. Just click on it, see which one I like best, and it will create the chart for you. Okay. And remember that in a chart, all fields can be right-clicked. So if you don't like something, if this gray field bothers you in the pie chart, you can click on it, right-click, come to Format, and then change whatever it is you do not like. So if you don't like the fill of that one, it's over here somewhere to help you change it. I'll make it bright red. Excuse me. So a couple of hints and things to remember from today. Pivot tables do not work with the original data, remember. Always remember you have that set of data underneath. I had somebody call me just the other day and say, hey, my pivot table isn't right. And we drilled down by double clicking on the field to look and see what was actually being reported in that pivot table. And we discovered that the data had been updated and it had not been updated underneath. So we refreshed it and all was well. You can go ahead and change the data source, or you can start over if you want to. I usually start over, just eliminate the pivot table and begin again. You can specify a worksheet, so you can put more than one pivot table on a worksheet if you want to. You can use a field in the fields list multiple times. No problem doing that. You can even use it in the same you can go back and use it in the same field. So I can put sum of number of bib items and count of number of bib items if that's what I want to do. And if you lose the pivot table fields, if it goes away, click back in the pivot table and you will find yourself at home. So that's a lot of information in 30 minutes.
Well, we have a question now in chat, Lauri. It's how do you set up a pivot table template to use with different sets of data?
So you have different sets of data and you want all the pivot tables to look exactly the same? Is that what you're saying? I'll wait for a clarification on that.
Yes.
Okay. If all you want to do is do a design, then you'll handle it just like a new design for a new table. You'll create your own. I think there's an entry in here somewhere for that. I haven't done that in a long time. Yep, new pivot table style. And create your own, and there it will be. I like when I'm working with the design. If I pick a design and I can say band the rows, I can say band the columns. I can make that change as well. I like doing that sometimes.
I just want to follow up on that question. To make sure I understand. Is it possible then with that design to basically make the same kind of pivot table for the same kind of data? Like if you were to use that design then in a new spreadsheet that had the same fields, would it automatically then populate it with your same row labels, sum of the cert, etc.?
No, it'll just make it visually look the same.
Okay.
Did I misunderstand the question?
I'm not sure that you did, but that was my interpretation of it.
Okay. If there is a way to make it go exactly the same way for same data, recommend. You could use this blank pivot table option down here. So if you're going to pull the same report every month and you want to build the same pivot table and you want it to have the same fields every time, you can come into the recommended and build a blank pivot table.
Very cool. I think that comes into close to what I was asking about.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any other questions? And if not, I actually do have a question myself. Okay, so I'll just ask. One of the things I was curious, when you were talking about Slicer, is it possible to use this to quickly generate lists of books that have a low circulation count and are older? Like, so you could like basically quickly set up filters, or like the book is older than, say, 5 years, and then also the book is, has no checkouts or less than 5 checkouts or something like that.
If you have that in your data, yeah.
I know I can do that in the filter easily, but I was wondering with the pivot table, is there an easy way to do that?
Yeah, you would just put last activity in, or maybe you want to use last activity type so that you get checkout, because my data probably going to be a little bit different from yours. I'm going to get rid of some of these. And we'll put last activity type in here. And that's count. Oh no, put the filter last activity type in here. And check out. And then you could go into the data and look at the date. We could also put that date in the field. Let's go back and look. If we put last checkout, yeah, I'd want to play with that a little bit, but yes, you could do that. You could. And that's what one of the things that I like about the pivot table is that I can play with it a little bit and get it the way I want. I don't want sum there. I actually want count.
I hope others are finding this useful, because I'm really finding this very inspiring for some of the stuff that we do where it could save time.
And to be honest with you, if you think you might want to try it out, you're not bothering your original data at all. It's still sitting there. And it takes just a click and a drag. I mean, it's no slower than playing solitaire to create the table and see if you can get the information that you want. I'm always surprised when people say, oh no, I don't do pivot tables at all. They scare me. Because what's to be scared?
Oh, we do have a helpful comment actually from John Thompson, who had the original question. He said, thank you, this was very helpful. I use Excel a lot, but I've never used pivot tables. And then Alexander Schneider says, I think it could really save time with patron record pools and such. Our system admin talks about pivots all the time, and it makes so much sense why she uses this tool now with the size of data.
Oh yeah, because we're looking at 16,400 rows, and look what it's boiled it down to. So.
I'll just ask, since you do continuing education, what do you think are probably your top 3 questions that people follow up with you the most on?
In Excel or in?
Just related to pivot tables, because you mentioned that people reach back out to you quite a bit.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. Well, I've been doing this a long time too. I have frequent flyers that reach out to me. The number one question that I get is the pivot chart fields is gone. Oh my gosh, I can't make my pivot table change. I can't do anything with it. And it's just because they've clicked away from the pivot table. That's it. If you click back in the pivot table, there it is again. And people are always like, it was that simple. That has to be the number one. Number two would be sum and count, because sometimes sum and count don't work the way you expect them to work on different data. And number three would be, I'm trying to do something with the data and Excel is telling me I just can't do it. And that's because they have exported the data from a database and the data is a little squirrely. Excel thinks it's text and it's actually a number, or it thinks it's text and it's actually a date and it's not working well. So I'd say those are the top three questions.
So with number three, they just really need to look at their underlying information and make sure that the format type is right.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, well, I think you've been great. If no one has any other questions, I think this has been a really good session. Thank you so much, Lauri.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. I haven't done pivot tables in a while, and it was a good stretch for a few minutes. I really enjoyed it. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. Our next session in March will be Heather Pirwar talking about Unsub and a couple of the other projects that she deals with. So we look forward to having you all at that. Remember, a recording of this presentation will be available in about 2 weeks. So if you have any peers, coworkers, etc., that would benefit from this, or if you just want your ability to follow up and maybe like see this again, it will be out there. So again, let's give a round of applause for Lauri. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Nick, what was the topic for our next session again?
The next session will be on Unsub. It is basically it's a browser-based decision-making tool for libraries to manage their journal collections. And basically it helps determine cost per use numbers, as well as visualize savings of journal cancellations. Dr. Pirwar also is part of Our Research, a nonprofit that backs Unpaywall. So if any of you guys have ever worked with Unpaywall, that's where it comes. They're the company it comes from.